It's November 6, 2017. We got a very special guest joining us this evening, Irene Lyon, all the way from Canada, British Columbia, Canada. We had Irene on the show a couple weeks ago as we were testing out our interview capabilities, and now she's back, and we're so happy to have her. The topics tonight, we're talking about stress and trauma and working through them both. So, Irene, thank you so much for being here. Do tell us a little bit about yourself for anybody that isn't familiar with your work.
Hey, you're welcome. Where do I start? Well, here I'm going to ask you a question. Out of what you've heard from me, what was the most interesting piece that kind of piqued your interest?
Well, I really like that SoundCloud you shared with me, the 7 steps to de-stress, and then your ideas about trauma, and also your ideas about the importance, kind of a mind over matter approach to things, where it's more important, your topic, where it's like it's more important that you have a strong community and that you have the right attitude versus trying to, we had the example of food, right, in our last talk, where you can go out of your way to try to eat as healthy as possible and avoid environmental toxins and all these things, but if you're stressed out because you're so focused on avoiding toxins, then the stress itself is going to cause serious health problems for you. So that's what caught my attention the most.
Cool. Well, we'll dive into that. One question, Max. I can hear myself in your background. Can you turn down volume?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. How's that?
How is that? Let's see. That's better.
All right, cool.
Cool. So it's what I do, as I said last time when we chatted, it's like so hard to describe because it's not your general run-of-the-mill stress management, breathe deep, change all the behaviors in your life so everything's perfect. I used to be in that industry in my 20s, in early 30s. And then as you do, as anybody who's been in the field gets to know, and they get to know like what's really happening out there with people, what's working, what isn't working, you start to see what works and what doesn't. And the thing with stress is that stress is dependent on how resilient our body is to handle it. And this is where the trauma piece comes in. And depending on so many factors, so our upbringing, how good our parents were with us. I know you talk about your mom all the time. She sounds amazing, right?
Definitely.
Not everybody had that chance, right? And not everybody's mothers had good mothers, and their mothers had good mothers, and it trickles down. And so what we're seeing right now, at least you could call myself a clinician. I used to have a private practice. I've kind of gotten away from that to work with people more in an online group setting so I can help more people at once. But what we're seeing is that trauma, like when I say trauma, what do you think of? Now, like pretend you didn't know me and you've never heard my stuff. What would you think of when I say trauma?
Well, like knee-jerk reaction would be like a car wreck. You could have trauma after that, like a sustained injury that sticks with you for a while. But generally it's seen as a physical thing.
A physical thing and a real big thing, a big accident. And what we see, or what I've seen in my work, I work from a body-based nervous system perspective, not just the brain, but the entire system, is that you could have 2 people in a car accident. I'll use that example. One person will walk away from that car accident with just a little bit of whiplash, but they're okay. They might be a little sore the next day. Maybe they have to get some physio, but they walk away. Their energy levels are fine. They have no phobia of driving again, and they just go on with their lives. You might have another person in that same identical accident, or maybe in the car with this person that walked away, and they come out of that accident completely messed. They end up having phobias, they get anxiety, they end up having PTSD, they end up having a whole slew of chronic pain. And if you track some of these people 10 years later, and I've worked with some of these people who had, say, car accidents our age in their 30s and early 40s, and in their 50s, they're still struggling. the question is, why does one person walk away fine and why does one person not when they had the exact same impact? And it comes down to what they've been exposed to earlier in their life and how resilient their system is and how much trapped stress is in their physiology. So it's kind of like, I have a glass of water here, right? It's like once the pool is full with trauma and stress due to usually past life adversity, abuse, multiple incidents when we're young, like surgeries are a big one that a lot of people don't talk about. Like we could list the things that people don't think of as trauma. Someone's pool is filled with so much, for lack of a better word, junk, and they don't have the skill set to release it organically. You put that car accident into their system and it'll literally shatter their system. And then we wonder, these people then go into the medical system and they kind of never get out. And they're the ones, I know you've talked a lot about opioids and pain medications. They're the ones that hop from these poor people, specialist to shrink, to rheumatoid doctor, to gastroenterology, to, and eventually they might end up with something big like an autoimmune condition. But what we've seen is that trauma is actually not in the event. This is a real important one. It's not in the event necessarily, it's in the nervous system. And this is why you'll meet some people, Max, who are just more resilient. They'll have a shitty thing happen to them and they really will bounce back and they go on with their lives. And one person will have something that isn't as stressful, but it floors them. And the research has really shown, and sadly, especially in the United States, that early adversity, child abuse, is like the #1 epidemic that nobody is talking about. And we have known this since the 90s.
Well, that's getting a lot of coverage in the mainstream now with like the Harvey Weinstein thing, the Corey Feldman thing, the sexual abuse of a child obviously has lasting repercussions, and it's a trauma that does not go away for a lot of people. Liz Bunya putting a good point in there in the comments. She says generational Native American descendant trauma. You mentioned past life trauma. Can you tell us about that a little bit?
Mm-hmm. So there's a few things. So there's generational. So what Liz is talking about there is our ancestry. So, the ancestors that we had that endured horrific, I don't even want to go into it, but all the horrific events that might have occurred to them, whether it's the Native population, whether it's the Jewish populations in Europe, whether it's wherever, pick your genocide, right?
Yeah.
And those individuals will survive. Lots of them do. And what occurs is their stress physiology has literally been so jacked up. And we talked about cortisol last time, which we can dip into again, but they've been so rewired for stress chemistry, right there. And it's not just the brain. It's really important to understand that it is the entire, like if you think about your system as a giant web, right, of electricity and nerve cells and cells, all those wirings and the DNA within it will change over generations. And what occurs is when there's been a lot of horrific communal trauma, national trauma, that will change the DNA and then it gets transferred to offspring. We talked about Gabor Mate, one of our favorite dudes that you and I both love, medical doctor and author. And he talks about his own being birthed, like I think it was the day that the Nazis walked into Budapest, Hungary. He was born and his mother had to give him to an aunt to keep him safe because they are Jewish. And he writes about fully his trouble with addiction, with ADD, with work being, a workaholic, and all these behavioral issues that stem from that rupture of attachment when he was young, compared to his siblings who were born in Canada, I'm pretty sure, who don't have these problems. And so he was treated well, right? He had a loving auntie, but his mother was stressed. The family was stressed. So even though this is where, you mentioned child abuse, there doesn't have to be abuse or horrific stuff happen. It can be just the stress of the time, the stress of the family. And right now, sadly, there's a whole slew of new trauma coming up that is because of lack of attachment and connection with well-meaning parents, but they're distracted by these things.
Right.
Yes. And the thing is that it seems so benign when you're raising a little person. Oh, what difference does it make if I'm on my phone when I'm walking them in the park and they're asleep in their stroller? It actually makes a huge difference. And so we're starting to see I call it the fallout, if you will, of affluent, middle class North Americans, Australians, people in, kind of UK, that real population of Western first world, where a lot of these teenagers and kids and young adults have severe anxiety. And we would even say they're more prone to trauma because they were never connected with in like the good way you and I might have been when we were young. And that's on top of perhaps bullying in school or some kind of other adversity. So to kind of wrap it around, there's this story that we've known about since the 80s around this need for good connection and good nurturing. And that is causing all of these behavioral problems. A lot of our chronic illness is because of these early imprints. And then that's where that generational stuff comes in. It can get passed along in the DNA if it's never addressed. So if we never heal and really feel the pain of our ancestors and do the work now, even though they may be long past, like 300 years ago, that's still kind of echoing in our system. And then the other thing that is like a totally different topic is past lives. So this is something I've studied. If anybody wants to read a great book, a book called Many Lives, Many Masters. It's written by a psychiatrist called Robert Weiss, I think his name is. And he stumbled across this by accident and proves in many ways that we hold on to old souls and we may express trauma from an old soul from another lifetime. And I've done enough of this work, and I've done enough of my own work to know that it's pretty damn real. And if you are open to it, right, this is that whole open-mindedness thing, this stuff will visit you. So anybody watching this right now that I've talked about, transgenerational trauma, past lives, and early obesity, I'm getting that now.
Hold on, we got a little feedback issue. Let me dump this screen out. I think that's doing it. I was trying to bring the book in. I found Many Lives, Many Masters, the true story of a prominent psychiatrist, his young patient, and the past life therapy that changed both their lives, by Brian L. Wise. Sorry to interrupt. We still got the bad echo there. Does anybody hear that?
Our ghost just came and visited us.
I think we're okay now. Sorry about that. I'm not sure exactly where that arose from, but do continue, Irene.
You hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. We might have just tapped into like another level. Seriously.
Yeah. That was really weird because like I don't have I was trying to bring up a web page, but I don't have anything playing there, so I don't know what it was. Maybe we, who knows?
We went into a portal.
Cool. All right, continue. So the past lives thing, if you're open to it and you're aware of it, you can tap into that and work through intergenerational or past life stress, right?
I believe that, and it takes more than just knowing it. It also takes knowing how to track the body in a more sophisticated way more than what we have been apprenticed here in like North American culture, first world culture. You know, shamans, tribal communities that really believe in spirit and in connection with everything, which I know you believe that, I believe that. Like when we can understand how all is connected, and in our body system all is connected, a domino effect can happen where our system starts to literally wake up to what needs to be felt, what needs to be processed, old traumas that are stuck in there. Even like if you broke your arm when you were 5 years old on your bike, that happened to me, right? Went over my handlebars. I like to go fast. And as an adult, I had to kind of negotiate some of the crookedness and pain in my forearm that popped up because I was becoming more in tune to my body. So when we have that better kind of focus internally, we really can shift a lot. And we, you know, people I saw when we got on are like, I'm so stressed, got a lot of stress. The more we can get rid of that old junk, believe me when I say our system has more space for the new stuff that we have to deal with. And there's so much complexity right now in the world, so much energy, you know, all these things that are coming at us, whether it's news, which, you know, you're passionate about, whether it's electromagnetic frequencies, whether it's toxins. The more I do the work and the more I work with people who have high sensitivities to things like EMFs and to toxic news, the more they get the junk out of their system and learn how to be their own medicine, which we can talk about a little bit more, they can handle the electricity, they can handle the news. And it isn't because they're like putting on blinders and shutting it all out, because that doesn't help either. It's because they're becoming better at filtering the yuck.
Yeah.
And they're not supposed to swear.
Yeah, I implemented a swear jar a while ago. You know, a lot of people commented on my videos that they like my stuff, but they can't share it because I cuss too much. So I'm working on it. We have a great question for Oduganwa Fakayote. Sorry if I mispronounced that, sir. How do we repair a lifetime of trauma? Excellent question. Irene, it's all you. That's your specialty.
So here's my analogy. I work in analogies a lot. It depends on a few things, but I think of it as learning a new language, right? So when you're learning a new language, what are the first things you have to do? ABCs, 1, 2, 3, as we learn how to count, right?
Yeah.
Say my name is, all these basic things. So we must first learn the basics of the nervous system, because that's where the trauma is trapped. So what the fight, flight, freeze responses are, how we get it trapped in our shock states, how we might have survival energy that was never allowed to express because it wasn't safe to fight back or tell your parents who are not nice to you to piss off, or that teacher that treated you like dirt. Like all the things that we couldn't do to protect ourselves, because when we're little, we often can't, right? And I think it's important to just respect the fact that if there was abuse and adversity when we were young, it's a real crappy thing. And how can we start to get out those survival responses that never got out? And I see someone just said forgiving the past. Forgiveness is an interesting thing, because should we forgive the person that was horrifically abusive to us? At the beginning, you can't do that, because you have to get out those energies of fight and anger and rage that you could never express. It's biology, right? Like you have a dog, I have some cats, I grew up with animals. Like if something harms them, what do?
Yeah.
Right? They're going to bite.
Either they're fight or flight, right?
They're going to growl, right? Yeah. They're going to lash out. Same with like a mama bear. I lived in Whistler, and if you ever ended up in front of a bear with her cubs, you're in trouble, right? You got to be real careful because she will protect. And so the thing with trauma is that pending the type of early upbringing we had, so I'm going to wrap it back to the language idea. If we had a really good upbringing, like let's say you and I did, we learned our ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. Right? We learned how to calm ourselves down when we were stressed. We had a parent that took care of us, that made us feel safe, that didn't say nasty stuff to us. So we had those basics. If we didn't get that, which is true for many, many people, we have to learn the basics of how to feel safe in our body and how to recognize when we might be like totally jacked up on stress. Or the flip side, which is actually more common in Western society, which is to be shut down and to just be numb. And so if we've had to numb out a lot of feeling and a lot of emotion and a lot of pain when we were little, let's just say, we have to, as adults, if we really want to do this work and really be as whole and as resilient as we can be, we have to be willing to feel the stuff that was never felt when we were really young. But, so here's the big but or the and. Just saying to someone, okay, yeah, you had horrific abuse, adversity, your parents were losers to you, they shamed you. I want you to now feel all that stuff. Like this month. Yeah. That's like telling someone, we're going to put you in a country that you've never learned the language. You're going to have no translator, right? The food that they eat, you're allergic to. So deal with it and see how you do, right? That would be petrifying for someone to do that. And so you can't just drop into this. So that, to go back to that question, how do you heal a lifetime of trauma? You have to, first of all, assess where you're starting from. Did you learn the ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, or did you not? And if you didn't, that's where my work comes in, where I literally teach people how to, in some cases, rewire or connect wirings in the nervous system that were never connected. Mm-hmm. And then when we can start to do that, we can start to bring more safety on board. That's like the S word is the key. Safety, like internal cellular safety. Because when we've had a lot of trauma, a lot of nervous system stress, the world is literally a dangerous place. And it feels dangerous. And this is sort of an epidemic right now in your fine country, is so many kids and so many people didn't get this good nurture. And so they're a beacon for like unsafety, and it's kind of like misery loves company. You attract things that are not safe to you when you have that nervous system that's looking for danger. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes good sense. And it seems like the mainstream media is happy to feed people all the fear they can possibly stomach. You know, it's like no shortage of bad news out there, from my experience. And no shortage of additional sources of really daily trauma. Was it? We had Derek Bros on the show last week, and he said that he's a guy who's really aware. He's very knowledgeable on every topic that's going on in the world today. And he says his approach to writing and focusing on these things, researching these things, writing about these things without letting it beat him down into this negative energy or this stressed responses. He tries to transcend it. He says he tries to rise above it. Is that a pretty common theme with people?
It is. There's two sides to that coin. I think he's right. Like, if I think of in a flash of my brain the stories I've heard, in my practice, things that have been done to kids from their own family, it makes you wonder how anyone can live. It's just like, it's terrible. And yet to keep doing this work, I have to flip it and say, this person is in my office or they're finding me online and they want to know how to get better. And to me, that's goodness, because it shows that that person didn't get defeated and they want to, in some ways, prove the system wrong, right? The abusive system. Yeah. And so you want to, there's this idea of transcending and not letting it bother you. It can go really well that way, granted you're grounded in your physical system. Okay. Have you ever heard of a concept, spiritual bypass?
No, I have not. Please fill me in, or fill the whole audience in. We've got a great audience, 84 people tuned in at the moment. So cool. Thank you all for tuning in, by the way. Keep the questions coming, and we really appreciate all the comments. Spiritual bypass, Irene, lay it on us, please.
So spiritual bypass, it's like a fancy way of saying not having, usually it's not having the guts, but it's not having the knowledge of how important it is to process the deep, painful, emotional, physical sensations that are trapped in our system. And so it's kind of like pushing the dirt under the rug and ignoring it, and then deciding I'm just going to like paint my house this brilliant purple or pink or whatever color you want, so that it looks so beautiful, but actually under the rug there's all this like disaster. Yeah. And there's like fleas and mites and cobwebs and old food scraps. And so when we think of the human body, when we push that stuff in and when we don't process it in that easy way, like that slow way of learning the ABCs and 1, 2, 3s that I talked about, we literally go into what's called a physiological shutdown, like a functional shutdown, but we're like keeping it all under. And this is a common thing in the spiritual communities, the yogic communities, the Kundalini communities, a lot of the communities that are highly based on deep meditation and trying to transcend. And the dead giveaways that someone's in kind of a spiritual bypass is when you talk to them, there's like no prosody in their voice. It's just kind of monotone. I'm so calm. Yeah. You know, I'm so calm and I'm in such peace and I love everything. And oh, pain? No, there's no pain. It's all love and peace. It's like, that's not real. And what we're finding is that a lot of these people, because I get these people in my courses, when they realize, I just spent 5 years meditating, trying to fix my anxiety. And yet all of a sudden I now have like Crohn's disease, or I have an autoimmune condition, or I can't sleep anymore, or I'm secretly taking drugs. There was actually a prominent meditation teacher in Canada who just overdosed on street drugs. And he was a guru. He was teaching high-level meditation, but he was struggling with mental illness and all this toxicity. And I know enough now from seeing people, working with people, hearing stories, hearing people who have killed themselves, sadly, because they haven't taken the time to learn the harder stuff in very incremental, small doses that they can handle. And they decide instead to just flip up and just in some ways transcend all the pain because it's too much to handle. So that's spiritual bypass. Robert, I think his name is, you can look it up. Robert, if you just look up spiritual bypass. Yeah. I forget my author's last names. But
I'll look it up.
You found it? Find it?
No, spiritual bypass. I'll find it. Great comment from Christelle Arcucci. She says another sign of spiritual bypass is it's all good, right? People.
Yep, it's all good. Or what was the one from Aerosmith? I'm fine, right?
Yeah. And Robert Masters wrote the spiritual bypass.
So that's kind of like, it's a weird thing because it's hard to speak this, but you know when someone's really there and when someone's not really there. And you see a lot, and it comes down to the physiology of just how they engage, the facial expression, their eyes, their body tone.
And like that faraway look, kind of like the, like the, what do they call it? Vietnam War vets, the 1,000-yard stare, where it's just like they're focused on a point way off in the distance, and they're not home. You know what I mean?
They're not. And I mean, that was the first research and indication that humans get PTSD was post-Vietnam War. I mean, and the interesting thing with that is that, you've talked about opioids and heroin, and that is a lot of those guys and were taking hard drugs over there because they had access to them.
Yeah.
And I would too, probably, if I was in such a situation, to keep myself calm. And when they got back to the United States, they didn't need it. But what they then did is they went into other addictive behaviors, other coping strategies, alcohol, tobacco. But that is like a classic thing that Gabor Mate also talks about when he talks about addiction, is that people feel that it's the substance that's the problem, but it's not the substance, it's the need for soothing.
Yeah.
So how we get that is dependent on what's available, right? But yeah, that I just saw someone say deadpan eyes, just it's a stare, and it's basically a sign that their system is literally shut down. And they've shut down this is the thing, they've shut down for good reason. It's because it's too much to feel all the chaos and what they've seen in the battlefield, and so they have to shut down.
Yeah. So let's say, how do you recognize that in yourself in terms of like self-awareness? Like if you're on your own, you're not in Irene's office, or you're not surrounded by friends, and you have a stressful experience, and like, how do you recognize that in yourself when your body's going into this freeze response?
There's a few ways. It depends on a person. So some people, again, it depends on genetically how a person is predisposed to handle stress. So I know for myself, no matter how stressed I got in, say, university or doing my work, I would never have a mental problem. It would always I'd get like skin rashes. That's my genetic predisposition, right?
Yeah.
And so a person is going to, I believe a person should get to know their body signs for when they're stressed. So that could be their digestion goes off. It could be that they're having trouble sleeping. It could be a dead giveaway sign is they're sleeping all the time and yet they're still tired. Getting like a cut and it not healing as fast as it maybe used to. But if everyone listening kind of really thinks globally in terms of their human system, there's like key systems. There's the digestive system, there's the immune system, there's the circulation, right? The heart, the blood, there's the muscles that either are tense, flexible, and pain. So there's all these big systems, hormonal systems. So for women, when their menstrual cycles are totally whacked and just not feeling good, if we track these systems, and if they tend to be sluggish and in pain and not processing the way that they should, that is a pretty clear sign that there is some form of physiological shutdown, some kind of freeze response where the system is not flowing in the way that it's supposed to.
Yeah.
So the other way that we know that we're in that kind of spiritual bypassy, kind of dissociated state, because dissociation is different than a true physiological shutdown, and I can get into that in a second, but is that we're wanting to kind of squirrel away and not see people. So we tend to be actually more introverted, right? And that's another topic that we tend to label people with. But when we're not wanting to engage, when we're kind of shying away, when we're feeling no desire to reach out and be engaged, when we have no oomph to learn, right? Humans are meant to learn. We're meant to be creative. We're meant to be together. And it doesn't mean like being at a party every single night. It could just be being with your favorite friend, or if you have a partner or one good friend, or even going out to the coffee shop and maybe you don't know anyone, but you just want to go and say hi to the barista, right? That is still a desire to connect. But when you start to find yourself finding ways to avoid that, that's one sign that we're in a bit of a survival state. But it's the opposite of like high anxiety, right? Like that global, like on total, like ADD, going a mile a minute, right? There's these different variations. It's like a spectrum. When we think of our survival physiology, there's real shutdown and disconnection. And then there's like going a mile a minute and not being able to pause long enough to just feel where I am, what I'm doing, that kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes good sense. It's funny you mentioned like the desire to just totally cut out away from social settings. For years, as I was, when I became more aware of all the problems in the world and all the depressing things going on, as I became more and more aware of it for a decade, I didn't want to hang out with people. I was like super apprehensive to check my voicemail, super apprehensive to check my email. I wanted to just run off into the mountains, or if I was in a social setting, I would, if I was out with friends, like the only way I could cope with it was by getting drunk. You know what I mean? Because now I can like I'm drunk, so I can let my guard down, and I can interact. But a lot of people can't. We talked about that last time. It's like if you're able to go out to a party and dance 100% sober, you're pretty
you're in a good spot.
Pretty in touch with yourself, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. We've got so many great comments in here. I wish I could share them all. People, we really appreciate you all opening up. Seen some really heavy duty things coming out in the comments, and I want to say thank you to everybody for sharing your experiences.
I saw one that passed by on the gut biome. I don't know if you can find that.
Has she ever looked into studies about gut bacteria? That one?
Yeah. So
what do you got to tell us about that? Obviously, like that's why the gut bacteria thing's big. You can go to any grocery store in the country now and buy kombucha, right? Everybody's big on the booch. School us, Irene.
Yeah. So here's the thing. Like, we want to have bacteria in our gut. Like we have so much bacteria in our body. It's, if you really think about it, it's crazy. And we know that we need a healthy gut bacteria because it actually, so here's the first science lesson. So you've got your gut. So if you guys want to play with me here, put your hands on your gut, like there's your gut and there's your brain, right? Yeah. And the direction of the nerves that go from the gut to the brain, the highway is like 80%. It's really wide. So it's like big highway. It's called the vagus nerve. A lot of people have heard of the vagus nerve. Yeah. So it goes up. It's like the largest branch of nervous system tissue in the body. So 80% goes up, but only 20% goes from the brain stem down to the gut. So this is why having a healthy gut is super important for this, but also everything, okay? Here's where it gets a bit troublesome, is we could eat every single type of fermented food that exists, but if our system has trapped traumatic stress, and if our system wasn't regulated from the start due to good parental connection, you can eat and drink as much sauerkraut, yogurt, kombucha, apple cider vinegar, kimchi, you name it, that exists, and it actually won't help because the gut isn't working properly because there is a stress that's causing the rest of the vagus nerve that starts in the brainstem to be, for lack of a better word, out of whack. So the gut is the brain, someone just said. When we're born, that is our brain. Like a baby doesn't have cognition to know safe, unsafe. They feel it in their stomach. Why do you think when a kid doesn't like a teacher, they get a tummy ache, right? It's like, right? We've all had that where we feel sick to our stomach. And it's not because we just ate something. It's because someone just said something not nice to us, or where we meet someone that we don't really like and we feel it in our guts. And the trouble with what's happening, I've seen, and I was in the nutrition industry for about 10 years before I got into the nervous system work, is that we're trying to solve the problem by adding on things like a Band-Aid, when the real root issue is at that nervous system level. So if we don't heal how we respond to stress, and if we don't heal the early traumas that we're still harboring, we can take all the supplements and all the therapies in the world, and it won't actually get our system resilient. It might add a little bit. I think there's nothing wrong with having a little bit of everything to kind of balance what we can. Like, I'm all for making sure a person eats vegetables and good fat and good protein, and I'll have sauerkraut with my salad every night because we make it. But if my system is clogged up with all that junk that I'm not processing, it just leaves the body because the body doesn't know what to do with it, if that makes sense.
That makes good sense. So Renee Escamilla shared a really powerful comment here, and then she had a follow-up. You're not going to answer me, so I'm going to share it. Renee asks, how do you deal with your baby sister shooting herself in the head in front of you, inches from your face? Very heavy experience there, and she wants a real answer, so that's what we're talking about today. So Irene, let us know.
So first of all, I'm sorry, right? No one should have to see anything like that, especially family. When something like that occurs that's so big, that gets classified as horror. So I'll say that again, like horror, like that's a horrific event. It's painful, it's shocking, but from a biological, like emotional level, that's a very horrific event. And we want to actually, and this might seem crazy, but we want to process the horror of seeing that. And I can't do like a private session clearly here because I don't know the person's history, how old they are, all of that. But what you want to do is, first of all, know that it's important to feel the shock and the horrificness that you saw. You also want to come back to yourself and realize that you are here and that you are alive, because there's something called survivor guilt that's real when we have a loved one that dies and we don't. I've seen this a lot in the backcountry community when people go skiing and their buddies die in an avalanche and you don't. And it's like, you know, there's a true guilt when you stick around and someone you love doesn't. But what I would suggest, I forget her name, was it Rachel?
Renee.
If you can find, I'm practiced in something called somatic experiencing. If you look up somatic experiencing, that's the work of Peter Levine, who I've mentored with. It's one of the things I do. Those therapists can work at that deep emotional level and allow you to feel that horror and shock, but in a way that's titrated so that your system can handle it and then process it. There's no doubt under that a ton of rage, a ton of sadness, a ton of pain. I'm going to say obviously a lot of grief. And then to just know that it's okay to feel the whole spectrum of emotions. But I mean, here's the thing. I've worked with some people who have lost children, not necessarily in that way, but through illnesses and accidents. And it's not necessarily something you totally get over, right? When it's someone so close to you, you have to find a way to bring more resilience into your system by processing those big emotions, but then also acknowledging that there will be waves of pain and feeling that will come But what I've seen when I've worked with people who have lost people in big ways is that as they learn the language of their body system more, and as they learn to digest and integrate rather than just shutting it out, each day gets a little easier, and they'll even go time where they're not in it, where they're not always re-seeing that image. And that's what PTSD is we are literally reliving, not necessarily reliving, but re-traumatizing our nervous system because we haven't deactivated the shock of the trauma. So that is kind of a way to package that question. A, no one should have to go through that. And B, you want to process the deep, deep shock, the grief, the horror that you might have seen. And then also, in such a situation, I would want to work with that person to help them see what can they do in their life now to get more resource so they feel more supported. And of course, how a person does that is very dependent on where they are, their situation.
Yeah.
So I hope that gives a little bit. I saw some people mention somatic experiencing, so that's good that a few people know about it.
Yeah, Tiffany Box has mentioned that. She said, somatic experiencing, amazing for healing, shock, trauma, and horror. I'm so sorry that happened, Renee. And obviously we all feel the same way. We're here for you, Renee. We're all with you. And thank you for opening up. It's funny, her letting us know that in your talk about that reminded me of my own experience last winter. I had my dog here, Maestra, you can't see her, but she's behind me here, laying in her bed, and she had a really, there was one guy who would always watch Maestra, this guy named Jack, and he died last winter. He died, he fell skiing a big mountain out here, and it was really wild because he wanted to come with me out to Standing Rock for my second trip. Right. And it was to the point where, like, I went over to his house. I decided I was going back to Standing Rock on a whim. Right, I got off work at 2 a.m. Maestra was in his bedroom, so I had to go get the dog and woke him up. And I was like, "Hey, man, I'm going to Standing Rock at 8 a.m." He says, "Oh, I want to come." I said, "Great, I'll come. I'm going to go home, get my stuff. I'll be back to pick you up." And in the morning, he changed his mind.
Oh man!
And he went skiing with 3 ladies who are all really good friends of mine too. And he died. I was at Standing Rock when I found out he died. And all of them have been struggling with the survivor's guilt. Yeah. It was his choice to go where he went. It was his choice. So nobody has like a direct, none of them have any good reason to blame themselves directly. But even me, finding out about that while I was at Standing Rock, I had this sense of guilt because what if I had just pushed him a little more to come with me? You know what I mean? So. Yeah. Anyway, a lot of great comments in there, but I guess it's important that everybody notes that we've all had our own experiences. We have different pasts, different upbringings, different ancestry, but no one is immune to trauma. We all have it to different degrees.
I think that's a really important point. It kind of. I always talk about flipping the perspective, and I've been thinking about this way more, is that, all of us have endured something. And I've never been one to say yours is bigger than that person's, right? Because we all experience a pain in the same way. It just is different degrees. And so I kind of, to do this work, I think, Max, and for people here who want to start to have a little more empathy towards all the stuff that we see that we just can't believe is happening, I do think we have to feel globally that we're all connected in an interesting way, and that we are all on, as Buckminster Fuller would say, this spaceship called Earth. And the more that we can do to heal ourselves, right? So if we think about the people in our lives that have passed, like your friend, for example, we want to honor them and then do what we have to do to process what we might be holding from those losses, because by not doing that, we contribute to the toxicity of the planet. And that can be a harsh thing for some to take, because if they've been harmed by someone, abused in whatever way possible that there is, there's often this feeling of, well, it's their problem to heal their abusive behavior, not me.
Yeah.
But every person who's been wronged, you have I believe, the job to heal your stuff no matter what, so that your system isn't toxic and can actually engage in the world in a productive way. But if we're continually fueling hate and anger, not so much anger, because anger is an important emotion to express, but if we're fueling, my cat's visiting, but if we can get that toxicity, oh, I sure heard
the dog heard the cat. Yeah, she's gone. She's on patrol. She's gonna find that thing. Sorry.
Oh, let's just let him say hi.
See, anger. She's real angry right now. Anger is built into the animal kingdom, even, right? The dog just can't accept that there's a cat out there, a black one at that. Ooh. Moving on here. Sorry about the distraction, everybody. These animals. This is not the most professional broadcast, not the most professional studio. But Laura Christine Wintro, actually, thank you for texting me earlier, Christine, asking about the show. Laura Christine Wintro, very excited to tune in tonight. And she had several great questions earlier that we'll get to later, but this is a big one. Her father committed suicide when she was 4. I remember she remembers it being one of her first memories. Irene, do you think the trauma affected me even though I didn't really understand what was going on?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So there's something called developmental or early trauma.
Yeah.
So that means before we really have either memory or the ability to process what was going on. So this is true for someone like herself, or someone who, when they were born, say, had to be in an incubator because they were born premature. Many babies have to have surgeries right away, which, if you think about how small a baby is, to have a surgery and be strapped down and all these things and not know what's going on, that's terrifying. And what happens is that their cognition isn't on board, but their somatic system, their body system is. And this kind of early experience is classic of people later in life having high level anxiety and panic that comes out of nowhere. So it's that time where you're sleeping at night and then all of a sudden you wake up and you can't breathe, right? It's like a suffocating feeling, terror. And there's no memory. I was never robbed, or I was never assaulted, or like, what is this? Often it's these very early imprints, or it can be, like we talked about a second ago, past generational trauma or past life trauma that's deciding to visit us. And the interesting thing is that when we start to wake up to this stuff and actually get healthier and have more supportive people in our life, what do you think happens? The system actually starts to let this stuff out because it's safe.
Yeah. Yeah, when people, in my life, I've had people open up to me about their experiences. People start to feel safe around me and then open up. When people do, here's a good question. It's great. Who is it? Ralph Shelton just had a great comment there. We come together. I have to blaze. This has been awesome. We come together and share here and have empathy for each other. Peace. It's so great to have people sharing their own experiences here. What do we do? Part of the healing process, I know for me, I feel better about my own situation when I'm able to help other people. What's the right response if a friend comes to you and confides in you, say something that's secret that they haven't shared with you before? They share their story, they share their trauma with you. What's the right response?
You listen.
Yeah.
Number one. you don't try to fix it. And it's kind of like, it's exactly the same as if you have a child that has just fallen and scraped their knee, right? You let them express the pain, you sit next to them, and you ask them what they might need, rather than going in there and trying to tell them it's going to be okay, you're fine, you know, whatever. As humans, we have a habit, and I'm guilty of it too sometimes with my husband. When there's a problem, we want to go into problem solving mode and fix it. And so if someone's confiding in you, one way to kind of alleviate that is to say, what do you need from me?
Yeah.
Like, what is it what could I help you with? And then as a friend, you also have to have boundaries, right? Because you need to take care of yourself too. And so if there can be an open dialogue where it's like, I'm here to help, and here's when I can, because I've been in situations and I've seen people who will overgive to the point where they then aren't taking care of their own system to take care of someone else's, right?
Yeah.
And so I know you're good with that, with making sure you get out and take time to be out in the mountains, even though you've got your passion here. We still have to have our own space to decompress and be us. So listen, don't try to fix it, ask what they need and how you can help them if they want the help. The one thing I've seen time and time again in doing this work is we can't fix someone who does not want to be fixed.
Yeah.
And
there's a really good quote, or a really good comment here from Tova Hooper. It's a long one. Especially in our culture, we are taught to suck it up, especially men. Be tough, don't cry. When I hear moms hush their crying children in stores now that I've learned this is not healthy, I feel sad for the child.
Yeah. Yeah.
Last night, a mother told a child who got hurt in a store, stop crying. All that noise isn't going to help anything. It hurts my heart to hear that when I now know they're not allowing the child to process the situation fully, teaching them to shut their feelings down, or that it's not okay to feel that way. Does that sound accurate to you?
That's bang on. That's how it starts. Like, this is the key where I talked about, like, people think that trauma is like being abused and raped and in war. And actually what's more insidious and more damaging, not more damaging, but what's harder to heal are these kinds of things where we actually had a pretty good home and there was food and we got tucked in every night. But during the day, we had these barking demands, or we were told that our feelings weren't validated, or that we, we did break our arm and nobody wanted to take the care to take us to a doctor to get it fixed or checked, that kind of thing. But the moment we tell a child to shut up, to be quiet, to suck it up, classic ones are be a big boy, be a pretty girl. I mean, these are kind of these stereotypical gender roles. It really takes that little human out of their impulse and out of their natural, organic way of taking care of themselves. And I see it all the time, and it drives me bonkers. And I've gotten better, if I go back to what I was talking about earlier, at filtering it out. It's not always easy, but you can't sadly do anything about that.
Yeah.
All you can do is really hope that kid has a good influence somewhere along their lives, or they seek out really good therapy when they're older. And often you talk to people who had maybe that harsh mom or dad, but they had an uncle or a grandfather or a grandmother or a school teacher that actually really did give them the time of day. And if you've ever known enough people in your lifetime, you'll know those people who didn't have the best upbringing, but they had like an adult figure that actually cared for them and let them know that they are good, right? Yeah. And it's so important to be that, if you can, for little people. Whenever I see a little one and I can make eye contact with them, whether they're being, talked at in an abusive way or not, I try to smile to as many babies as I can. Toddlers, I'll look at them and I'll wink, and if they're engaged, they'll look at you, they want that kind of engagement. And parents these days tend to be just so preoccupied that they don't even know how to attune to the problems.
Yeah. Or do put a good comment in there. Having children in modern life is tough. That's the truth, isn't it? In the modern world where 50 years ago, the typical family in the Western world could live off of one person working 40 hours a week. Now, increasingly, people, both parents are stuck working maybe 50, 40, 50, 60 hours a week, and stressed about money, stressed about health, stressed about maybe they value consumerism more than they should, or they're addicted to whatever. There's there's so many distractions in the world today.
There are. And I think, I always say, I have a vlog that I did a while ago. I'll see if I can find it, where I say, you don't have to mess up your kids, right? Like, there's always this thing when people have children, they're like, oh, I'm sure I'm going to screw them up somehow. And I'm like, actually, you don't have to. And the thing is that it's complex, but if you can learn to attune to them on day one and know what they need, things will be okay. But because we've missed this mark and we've gotten so cerebral, right? Think how many books are on the bookshelves about raising children. Like, no one in the Serengeti or in tribal communities are reading books about how to parent. They're just doing it naturally from intuition.
Yeah.
And we have it. We have that intuition, but we've second-guessed ourselves. I work with a lot of moms who feel horrific when they find out that letting their babies cry themselves to sleep was the worst thing that they could have done, because the pediatricians taught that at one point. The only way they're going to learn how to self-soothe is to lock them in their crib and let them cry themselves to sleep. That's one of the first traumas that a child has, is that, because what occurs is they're not self-soothing in a good way. They are in fight, flight, and then they shut down because they can't handle the intensity. And so that, even just that way of teaching parents, like in the 50s and 60s, and some still do it now, is very harmful to that nervous system. But you talk to moms who tried to do it, some tried to do it, and they couldn't handle it because they felt terrible. And that's good. Like, if a mom's like, I can't do this, I have to pick them up. Good, pick them up. They're meant to be picked up when they're crying, right? You're not going to spoil a child by picking them up when they're an infant. They need that connection because they don't know how to self-regulate.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty absurd. I remember a really, when I was studying in philosophy, they told us how, the biological determinism argument of philosophy, where it's like, well, your genetics basically run everything. That's something Gabor Mate talked about a lot with attention deficit disorder. The notion that everything is genetic is just utterly absurd. And it still is widely promoted. And like these child rearing techniques where it's like, no, teach your kid to be tough, teach them to be alone. That's utterly insane, right? I mean, we've evolved as a species to live tribally. My mind comes up with like the image of a family in a teepee, right? You got everybody in the same bedroom,
on top of each other,
smelling each other's farts, hearing each other snore, and just knowing each other's around, versus the modern world where it's like, well, all the kids have to have their own bedroom, and baby's got its crib. It's like,
no, it's really, we've really come far away from it. And, it can be simple, but we've just bleached our intuition out of our systems. And I'm actually, the thing that's really positive is that I'm meeting a lot of younger folks who haven't had children, and want to. This is changing because I've met a lot of women in their 50s and 60s who didn't have kids because they didn't want to have what happened to them happen to their kids. Yeah. They didn't know there was a way to change that. But now I'm seeing 20-year-olds and even early 30-year-old women who want to have kids, and they're choosing to heal their systems first. And I'm like, oh my God, if that could just become a campaign, because not only will their systems be healthier and they'll know how to attune to their babies because they can attune to their systems, they're going to find a partner that's better for them because they're healthier, right? And so there's like this, it's like this really interesting way of genetically modifying our next offspring is actually by not doing anything that's chemically induced, but just working on our own systems from that environmental nurture point of view, and then everything will just take care of itself. That's kind of my like utopian wish, is that all women who haven't had babies yet choose to work on their trauma and heal so that they find like a really good, safe partner that isn't going to abuse them, and then they can have a good child and be symbiotic together. Because if anyone knows anyone that's had an abusive relationship or has had trouble parenting, that's not an easy thing to change once it's happened. Yeah. Right.
There's a comment here I really want to share from Dory Blackney. It's kind of off topic, but I think it's an important one. Dory Blackney in Australia, PTSD sufferer here in Australia. I'm about to drop the handle. It's getting too exhausting physically to keep it under control. Dory's been waiting 5 years for a basic medical procedure, and the mental health waiting lists are longer. They're not going to get to Dory in time. What do you have to say to our friend Dory there? Dory, thank you for sharing your story. We're all here for you. And Irene, turn it over to you.
I'll be honest, that's a tough one, because some folks have gotten to a point where they really do need one-on-one help, and it's just not available, not the kind that they need. I would suggest, Dory, I know Max had my site up. Go to my website, and on that I have a lot of free resources, like audio. Max did one of my audio downloads. There's resources, there's audio lessons, and learn a little bit. If you can maintain curiosity about your and if you maintain an interest feeling, and if you can know that it okay, a big echo. If you can do a little bit every day to add a little bit of learning to your system, doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be this big flip with the post-traumatic stress, but if you can add a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of curiosity, a little bit of hope, really, by learning a little bit more about why your system got to this way and what has to happen to build back some capacity, I've seen a lot of things shift just by that interest. But there has to be an interest to do the work yourself. The waiting to get in to see someone, that will only get us so far, because right now, sadly, the medical community doesn't know how to properly work with PTSD, right? It's unless they medicate you, which for some works, but in the long term, it's not enough. These medications are not meant to be taken long term. And a lot of the folks that I'm seeing who have been on these medications for multiple years are actually having a real trouble because they need to get off of them and they can't. So go to my site and just work through some of those things would be my suggestion. And you got to have an interest and a curiosity to learn. It's about learning. To me, learning is like parallel to healing, because anybody I work with gets better because they decide to learn. Right?
And Benjamin was chimed in, Dory in Australia. There's some good ways to help. I suffer PTSD as well. I work with two counselor. So Benjamin, maybe it looks like Dory's going to message Benjamin, so that's good. Lots of comments here. So many. Liz Bunya saying, Dory Blackney, you can friend me. I can share some things with you as a survivor, and I'm making it without proper help. Liz was out at Standing Rock. Thank you, Liz, for your presence here tonight. Thanks for everybody here tuning in. Wow. Flipping back to, you mentioned like the early on in the broadcast, you mentioned the smartphone, and you mentioned the point with like the parent, I think, you talk about the intention of healing, and you brought up the point of a parent walking their child in a stroller through a park, right?
Yeah.
And the baby's asleep, but if mom is focused on her phone, that has an impact, right?
Heck yeah.
Yeah.
It's,
And, in my line of work, the reason I'm, my own so-called attention deficit disorder when I was a kid, that I had to work through. At the time, the medical establishment said, "Oh, it's genetic. Take these pills." I never took the pills, but if I was a kid nowadays, they probably would have forced them on me because I was the wild child in the classroom, right? And now we see this epidemic of autism, right? And people are quick to point the finger at vaccines, which probably a factor. People are quick to point the finger at diet and all these things. But what is the impact of like setting a kid down in front of a TV or giving them a phone to play with to shut them up for 4 to 8 hours a day? Irene, can you tell us a bit about your experience with that or your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are that it isn't the TV that's the bad thing. Because I watched a lot of TV when I was young, but the difference when we were younger is that it was on at a certain time and then it was off, right? Like Scooby-Doo was only on at 4 p.m. and Sesame Street was on at whatever. Like it was, and the sitcoms were at a certain time. And now there's just this, it's all the time. So that's one thing. The second thing is that in that first 0 to 5 years, that's like the magic window when you want to be teaching a little person how to come down without having to be distracted, right? Or needing a reward. And the thing that's occurring, I was just traveling in Europe in September. I'm about to write an article on this. It's almost finished. But there was a little kid, this poor guy, maybe 4 years old. We were touring the Roman Colosseum and that whole area, like ancient Rome, for like 6 hours, right? So anyone is going to get tired after 6 hours. And there was this little guy who was having a meltdown, right? And basically he wasn't being attuned to, like nobody was playing with him. They were forcing him to be an adult. He's not an adult. He's a 4-year-old. And then all of a sudden he was quiet and I looked over and of course, what was he? He was looking at a game or something or whatever. And the problem with that is that the parents, don't know that by not connecting with him to bring his system down, he is not learning how to do that internally on his own. He's needing an external thing to basically give him a shot of dopamine to bring him back down. And I think that if you have to do that once in a while, you're not gonna, go to hell. But if you're doing that multiple times a day, every day, there's a problem. And so here's the interesting part to that story. We had to wait for 20 minutes, like in the bowels of the Colosseum for our next tour. And he started throwing these rocks. I'm sure this is something you would have done, Max. He saw these rocks. He's like wanted to play with them. And the parents were just kind of ignoring him, standing to the side. And they started doing we're going to count, 1, 2. That doesn't help. We're going to give you a timeout. That's not going to help. So, because I didn't want to see this kid get smacked because he had gotten spanked earlier, which again isn't going to help. I'm like, okay, we got to deal with this. So I sat down on the rocks and he saw me because he's like, holy, a big person sitting down. And I picked up a rock and I was like, can you find me a circle? Right? Let's find a circle. What shape is this? I engaged with him. I played with him. And within a second, he was fine.
Yeah.
And then the thing that
kid just wanted some attention, right? Just wanted to be
together.
Some connection with a human, right?
Yes. And it wasn't rocket science. And the thing that was so interesting about it was after 20 minutes, the mom came up to me and she said, wow, you must be a teacher. You're so good with kids. And I'm like, no, I didn't say anything. I just kind of smirked. But, this is the thing. This isn't a hit against them as parents because they actually don't know. And this is the problem, is that there's that lack of attunement. That's the magic word here. There's nothing wrong with a parent being on their cell phone when they're waiting for their kid to come out of ballet practice. But the moment that kid is with you, you put the thing away and you connect with them, right? Because they start to understand that they're not worth your time.
Yeah.
And so there's this balance, I think, that has to happen where we have to realize that the devices serve a very good purpose. If there wasn't for this, you and I wouldn't have found each other again, right? So the internet and all this serves a really good purpose, but in that very critical time from 0 to 5, those little people need connection and they need to be played with. They need creativity. Your mom could talk about this. She was a school teacher. You got to do art and imagination and games. That's what they need to develop their brain. And by only interacting with a phone that might be giving them some feedback, it's still not this textual way of doing things.
Yeah, it's not as satisfying as a human experience. Lori Root Riley had a great comment, and then the kid will do bad things to get mom and dad's attention, right? The kid is ignored. The only time mom and dad pay attention is when they're punishing the kid. And then the kid learns some really bad habits, right?
Well, that's what was happening with this kid in Rome, is he knows that the only way to connect is if he becomes a brat.
Yeah.
And it's
I've got a great question here from Nicola Hamilton. She's asking, what advice do you have for someone with severe anxiety, panic disorder, and now agoraphobia?
So Nicola, if you didn't hear the beginning, maybe go back. I talked about the ABCs and 1, 2, 3s of learning the language of the nervous system. That's what you want to do. So the people I work with fall into exactly what you're talking about. You want to figure out, did you have that lack of connection when you were young? Some of the people that I work with who have the most severe anxiety, it wasn't because they had adversity that was apparent. It's because mom was actually depressed and couldn't connect, right? So if you think about that little baby who is looking for a connection, and mom has, say, postpartum, which is very common, which is another trauma in itself that we don't know how to work with effectively in our culture. If that's happening, that little one is looking for something, and then all of a sudden they're not there. That is highly anxiety producing, right? And I just saw, she said she was separated at 8 months, was it?
Yeah.
So
separated from mom at 8 months.
Yeah. So that, I mean, it seems oversimplistic, but that's actually it. So when we have that deep separation and that loss of our bond, it makes a huge impact on our physiology. It's not the brain. It's an important distinction. It's the entire stress chemistry is looking for safety. And if it doesn't get it, it's going to stay ramped up in that adrenalized state.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. Everybody sharing their stories here tonight. Really powerful experience here. It's an honor to be here with all of you talking through this stuff.
I just saw, can I address, someone talked about Lyme?
Yeah, Benny K. Navajo. Benny's been putting a bunch of comments in. What do you say? They're killing us. Talk about that. Like the depopulation agenda. It is pretty shocking, the incidence of Lyme disease right now. So many people with chronic fatigue symptoms, Lyme disease symptoms. But I know up until not that long ago, Lyme disease was very rare, and now people are being diagnosed with it all the time. So, Benny K. Navajo, here you go.
So the thing with Lyme, yeah, it's real. I mean, it's a thing. It affects people, but just like you said, Max, my dad was covered in ticks as a kid. I know people who were, he worked on a farm, like many deers, animals get them. The thing is, when we have, and again, I talked about this with my glass of water that's now empty at the beginning, like when our system is full with stress and it is toxic because of past stressors and past traumas, and we can't downregulate naturally, when we get something like Lyme or a virus or a common cold even, it's going to impact us way more. And I've worked in my programs with quite a few people that have been struggling for like 20 plus years with Lyme, chronic fatigue, pain, all of it. And they have gotten remarkably better, not by addressing the Lyme, but by addressing the stored trauma in their system and the dysregulation of the nervous system. And it's sort of like, it's hard to understand that when we're treating Lyme as the problem, but Lyme is on top of what was already unwell to begin with.
Yeah, because the immune system will fight Lyme disease if it's functioning properly.
Yeah.
Right? And that's something that I was, I medical school dropout. One thing I learned in my research with, Dr. Gaber Mate especially clued me into it, is that cortisol, the stress hormone, if you're continually stressed, and obviously traumatic experiences will contribute to stress, financial worries, relationships, reading the depressing news. There's so many ways to get stressed out. But if you're perpetually stressed out, that's going to compound your problems, because when your system's flooded with cortisol, your immune system shuts down, repairing, like the repairs in your brain shut down. So stress literally kills.
It does. And it's very much this thought that if we improve our health through diet, and we talked about this last time we talked, and all these lifestyle behaviors that will improve, and we might to a certain degree, but in the time frame right now of like the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, those people that improved and cleaned up their lifestyle, many of them are still sick. And it's because they have not gotten into this deeper layer, which is trauma being stuck in the nervous system, and then it's dysregulating it. But it's like most of us carry, for example, the chickenpox virus, right? Most of us, a lot of people carry the herpes virus. If you talk to anybody, when they get stressed, what do they get? A cold sore. What do they get? Shingles.
Yeah.
Right? We're actually we carry a lot of stuff, and depending on how resilient our system is and how every night when we go to sleep, if that sleep is actually restorative, we clean up cancer cells, we can clean up viruses that are trying to encroach. And it all comes down to checks and minuses, right? The balances, like as we start to not balance and get rid of the stress, the bad stuff's going to take over. Yeah. So stress is an interesting one. You got to pick your battles, because I think there's some things that we should get pissed about, but we also don't want it to consume us to the point where that's all we're thinking about, which I know you've had to learn.
Yeah, I've had to learn that one over time. Lori Root Riley summed it up pretty well. She says, because we all worry about the whole world, we need to de-stress, right? That sense of, maybe it manifests as hopelessness or despair or a sense of powerlessness, like, wow, I see all these issues, but I can't change them. The world, there's so many problems that I personally cannot change. And it's like, how do you find that balance of being aware, but also letting go?
Well, I think this is the motto that you and I share is, I mean, when I talk about, these kids that I see that are being abused and verbally, talked down to, it's like, I actually can't do anything about that directly. You know, a lot of people have said, well, why don't you go up? And it's like, no, it's not my place to go and school that mother, because she actually doesn't probably even know she's doing it, because it was probably her. So the only way I see, and I mentioned this a second ago, is you know, if you take a step back and truly see that every single human being is a cell of this planet, because we are, right? We are, just like every single cell in our body makes up our body. If you work on your own stuff, and if you work on your family system and make it as resilient and as free from trauma, not free from stress, but free from trauma, and you work on the stuff that needs to be worked on, you are contributing greatly to the whole of the planet. And a lot of people think that that's not enough. Trust me, it's enough. If enough people understood this whole stress physiology thing, we would be in a much more different place. But a lot of people are trying to breathe the stress out. We talked about deep breathing last time, right? We're trying to do these things to manage the stress, as opposed to really learning how to work with the stress so it actually is gone completely.
Yeah, like I can think of, looking at my own life, a good example, like, there were times where I was so stressed out about the overall situation in the world, trying to change it for the better.
Yeah.
And what did I do? I took it out on my friends, or I took it out on my significant other.
Yeah.
And then I was doing the exact opposite of what I was trying to do. Because instead of like bringing healing and awareness and connection to humanity, I was literally ripping it apart in my own, in like my small sphere of influence, like in my core sphere of influence. I was creating exactly the opposite of what I was trying to create all over the place, right?
Totally.
So that makes perfect sense. That's really a good point. If everybody sorted out their own shit, the world would be a much better place.
The world would be a much better place. For every time you want to post that article that makes you pissed, or protest something that you don't believe in, if you took that 5 minutes to just work on what maybe is in your system that is actually getting sparked up. Like, often when we get pissed about something, it's not necessarily because of that thing. It's because it's sparking up something old in our own system that we haven't dealt with.
Yeah.
And so it's like, we got to flip it back to us and take personal responsibility for our stuff. Because the more we energize the crap that we're seeing in the media, it's feeding it. It's like we're feeding that beast. It's not about ignoring it, but just don't feed it, because the more we feed it, the more it grows, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of my 2 bits on that one.
Oh, that's really good. Benjamin Nicholas had a couple great comments there. He says, I know it sounds hard, but it is true. You were born to be a joyful being.
Totally.
And another great one from Benjamin. Everyone that suffers, remember, you are still allowed to be happy.
Totally.
Simple, common sense, legit statements.
I've got a good quote I'm going to read. And then I have to go soon, Max. I have a dinner date at 30.
Yeah.
So, because we could keep talking for like 5 hours. So this isn't a quote, not a quote. This is actually something that my mentor, Peter Levine, who I mentioned, who's the founder of Somatic Experiencing, he said this in passing at one of our mentor trainings. He says, true human enlightenment will happen when all human beings on this planet have regulated their nervous systems.
There we go.
To him, that's like true enlightenment. And we have a long way to go, because most of us are living in survival.
Okay, one real quick one here. Laura Christine Wintro, who I'm sure she's going to hit you up. She had a lot of questions. Still wondering if you have any insight on sleep paralysis before you go. She mentioned earlier how she would suffer from sleep paralysis. Do you have any, as a closing comment? I know you got to go, but anything you can share on that topic would be great.
So usually sleep paralysis, and maybe as I talk, you can type it in the comments. If you've had anesthesia, so let me know if you've had a surgery, an anesthesia, if you've had anywhere where you've been pinned down, and it doesn't have to be because of an assault. It could have been when you were a little kid and you had to get stitches and they needed to pin you down. So if you've ever been put under often sleep paralysis occurs when there's old anesthetic and surgery trauma lingering in the system. It also can sometimes come out when we've had a near-death experience. So almost drowning, almost choking, almost dying. It could even be almost dying of a high fever or infection when we were really young, when we were an infant. So we might not even remember some of the things. So anything that brings the system to a near-death state, and anesthesia is putting us to sleep. It's literally putting us into a death state, right? If there was any fear or anxiety around that, that can get trapped in our system. So it's definitely, to me and to what I've seen, that is often what's going on. So it's a deep, deep shutdown, a deep freeze state that the system's trying to resolve. So that's one thing to look at. Anesthesias, near-death experiences, and then if there was a real significant shock that put your system into like shutdown, which is why it goes with narcolepsy.
Yeah, that's Kathy Hathcoatville saying sleep paralysis is a form of narcolepsy. So Irene, I know you got to go. Hopefully we can get you back on the show again. I don't know what I got to do, but I'm going to try to convince you to come back. Obviously, this interview, very, very great experience for everyone. I don't know about you, but like you talk about how you need to learn to speak the language, and having a discussion like this, we're practicing that language and just talking about it with people sharing their stories. It works. We're learning the language.
We are. Thank you. Keep doing it.
Thank you so much. I know you got to get going. Have a lovely night. We'll talk to you soon, hopefully. Anything you want to say? You all done?
Be good to yourself.
Be good to yourself. Wise words from a wise woman. Thank you, Irene, dropping her out. So there we go. Irene Lyon laying it on us real good today. Hopefully we don't get that weird feedback, but I just want to show you her website real quick. IreneLyon.com. Check out her work. You can sign up for her mailing list and stuff. This How to De-Stress in 7 Steps is a nice, it's on SoundCloud. Check that one out. But get in there, get on her mailing list. She sends out quite a bit of info, and I've been enjoying it. I bet you'll enjoy it too if you're still tuned into the broadcast here. Wow. What a great night. Thank you all for tuning in. Tomorrow, we've got a lot of big interviews coming up, on other topics. Tomorrow, we got a twofer. We're talking with Jim Lee from Climate Viewer. Jim's a brilliant researcher dealing with geoengineering, weather modification. So we're talking with him, and then Dominique, I'm going to butcher his last name. It's an Italian name, Morello. I forget, Morella. Dominique from Weather Modification History tomorrow night. Then the next day, we've got Seth Lyon, who's actually Irene's husband, and he's a bright, bright, bright man. Obviously, you'd have to be to snag a woman like Irene. And they're going to be talking about, or he and I are going to be talking about history from a unique perspective. So that should be good. And then on Thursday, we've got none other than Carrie Wedler from the Anti-Media joining us. So really great. Thank you all for sharing. Nyla Clancy, thank you. Thank you, Lori Root Riley. Thank you, Nicola Hamilton. Jerry Ann Durbin Fairman, thank you so much. They state your comments were acting up. Sorry about that, Jerry Ann. Hopefully once we end the broadcast, we'll be able to see that. It's a darn shame that Facebook censors the comments, and they'll have their top comments, right? All these people share these great stories, but the whole story is not represented in the comments when Facebook censors them for no apparent reason whatsoever. So that's frustrating. But Geo Folds, thank you so much for tuning in. Susan Hamilton, I'm glad you enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for being one of my Patreon subscribers. Liz Bunya, thank you so much for tuning in. Brian Keith Will, thank you for tuning in. A smiley face. All these thanks. Marianne Fitzgerald, you're very welcome. On that note, I'm going to sign out. Tracy Lee Hamilton, thank you. JT Jones, thank you. Everybody, right? Sign up at IreneLyon.com. Let her know you appreciate her work. And tune in tomorrow here at Wake Up News when we're talking, we got a twofer on the topic of geoengineering, weather warfare, and weather modification. Should be another interesting, thought-provoking discussion here at Wake Up News. Y'all take care of yourselves. Stay aware. Stay optimistic. Deal with that trauma. Deal with that stress. You're going to be okay. And remember, the more stressed you are, the sicker you're going to get. So, work on yourself and everything else will work out. I hope. One would hope. You might as well try. What do you got to lose? On that note, signing off. One love.